Hi, friends. Just wanted to hop on here and give you a quick update as I progressed on my reading journey through Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Look at how cool this cover is, by the way. One of my favorite covers. I took Virginia with me on a trip to Washington last week, specifically Seattle, Washington. My last trip prior to the insanity of last year was a lovely girls' trip to the Pacific Northwest, specifically to Portland, Oregon, and that was right before the world shut down. My very first trip out of quarantine came full circle and also happened to be in the Pacific Northwest. So this was a fun little observation on serendipity after I planned the trip. But more to the point, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. I must admit, the last and first time I read Virginia Woolf was an assignment for my AP Lit class back in high school. I was assigned to read A Room of One's Own, and I hadn't really dived into Virginia Woolf since then. My goodness. So I'm super happy that I get to rectify that with Mrs. Dalloway. A bit of backdrop right off the bat that I personally found interesting. This book began right after, or Virginia Woolf began on this book right after she had finished reading James Joyce's Ulysses. And due to the inspiration she found there, she decided to also write a novel that would focus on a single day. And this one here happened to focus on a single summer day in the city of London in June of 1923, 5 years after the end of World War I. I found that to be a particularly interesting observation. My reading of Mrs. Dalloway was colored by that fact because in my reading, I saw a tired London, I saw a battle scarred London, a London trying to find ways to revive itself after a bloody war. The way Virginia Woolf wrote and added color to her characters, it seems to me, was very much colored by that experience of war and post war days. One can almost sense a desire to understand what on earth it was that they had just lived through, that they had all collectively as a city lived through, and personally as individuals lived through as they had lost family members to war and the trauma that comes with it. We certainly see bits and pieces of that in some of the characters, such as Septimus Smith. So I found this strand, this specific strand, trying to make sense of the human elements within us despite the calamities outside us, a very glaring presence in the book. And it was an interesting way of tying all of this on a timeline to my own personal reading, because my reading of it came shortly after the being flung into pandemic mode for about a year and a half, at a time when I too saw a similar desire to be observant about oneself, one's surroundings, the people you surround yourself with. I've noticed that these days in myself, I've noticed it in others around me, and I've also happened to notice it in the way that Virginia Woolf constructs her sentences here. The setting of the novel itself is very basic. Mrs. Dalloway is a perfect hostess, aged early 50s. I believe she was 52 here, and she wants to throw yet another perfect soiree. And in the midst of preparations, she spirals down memory lane. We get a whole host of characters appearing and disappearing in the span of a single day, marked by Big Ben's towering bells ringing and punctuating the passage of time at the hour, every hour. Woolf has an incredible way of using the theme of time to her advantage as a writer. By that I mean she's able to mark the passage of time in a very practical and obvious way by having the chimes organize and situate the reader onto a timeline. But she then also adds a flow to the passage of time by writing in the style of stream of consciousness. Meaning she ditches the old traditional Edwardian style of treating characters as data points, observing where they're from and what they do, what their occupation is in life, and instead highlighting characters from their interior, what their psychological makeup is, what they are feeling, where their minds wander. And there is a lot of wandering and meandering that goes on in the text, and it could be a tad confusing at times. I like to think of it as the meandering and wandering that we do throughout the day as we, have random thoughts pop up in the day, or when we're on a stroll in the mornings or in the evenings. In any case, Virginia Woolf embraces this style of writing, one that is very symbolic with the generation that she finds herself in among her peers like James Joyce and Marcel Proust. By the way, if you are a fan of Marcel Proust and his meandering and, my goodness, very, very lengthy sentences, then you'll come to enjoy Virginia Woolf. She's not as heavy-handed when it comes to wording, but she has that same flow of thought that is, in her case, very interestingly marked by semicolons. She uses so many semicolons throughout the text in a very long-winded and flowy way. It seems to be very peculiar to her, so I enjoyed that little observation. I've also noticed how beautifully Virginia Woolf weaves London into her writing. She treats the city as though it were a character in its own right, a living organism. It reminds me of the attraction that I hold to New York and how I view it as a beating heart. The same could be said of cities in general, but Virginia Woolf reminds us that there are certain quirks about a city or certain moments that could easily make the city our very own. This reminder is a pleasant one to have throughout the text because she has lots of passages that deal with the city itself and her description of it. And Woolf brings that element of treating the city as our very own out into the forefront when she describes in this London itself. As I read this book, it felt in so many passages that I was feeling that I was inside the heads of these characters, inside their feelings, and just living through very real, very raw lived moments of June 1923, which ended up being somehow still relevant in capturing the feelings that one might have toward a city or towards people. And that just goes to show you how the magic of good writing. This novel is certainly, as the introduction suggested, a novel that speaks to the poetic side of a reader, places us, the reader, inside the lived moment. We're able to glance at what life feels like. And there are passages that I annotated to no end that really harken back to this idea of living through it with the characters themselves. For example, in making a simple description and observation of one of the characters, Elizabeth, who happens to be Mrs. Dalloway's daughter, there's a description of her trying to find a seat on the bus as she escapes a love-struck woman in a cafe and abandons her. Despite the woman being totally in love with her, Elizabeth nonchalantly, just almost selfishly decides to revel in her own freedom, as a young person might at that age without regard for other people's feelings. Woolf captures that sentiment of youth and the spirit of freedom so beautifully here when she writes, quote, "She took a seat on top. The impetuous creature, a pirate, started forward, sprang away. She had to hold the rail to steady herself, for a pirate it was, reckless and scrupulous, bearing down ruthlessly, circumventing dangerously, boldly snatching a passenger or ignoring a passenger, squeezing eel-like and arrogant in between, and then rushing insolently, all sails spread, up Whitehall. And did Elizabeth give one thought to poor Miss Kilman, who loved her without jealousy, to whom she had been a fawn in the open, a moon in a glade? She was delighted to be free. The fresh air was so delicious." And yet again, another one that deals with the same set of characters. Quote, "The waitress came. One had to pay at the desk," Elizabeth said, and went off, drawing out, so Miss Kilman felt, the very entrails of her body, stretching them as she crossed the room, and then with a final twist, bowing her head very politely, she went. She had gone. Miss Kilman sat at the marble table, cold, among the eclairs, stricken once, twice, thrice by shocks of suffering. These words take on such a peculiar and personal feeling of longing for me, given our backdrop of crisis mode for the past year and a half. It felt like stepping inside lived moments and finding there a loved link between the most mundane and ordinary of acts. For example, a woman going out to buy flowers. Opening lines of Virginia Woolf when she writes, "Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself," to a couple sitting on a park bench and viewing the airplane contrails. All those ordinary moments and their new momentous resonant significance. I don't know what to make of it other than to feel a sense of gratitude for getting to do the ordinary things in life that I personally get to do, being able to go out grocery shopping or working out, being able to feel sore the next day. Woolf's opening lines take on an impression in my mind's eye that would not have poofed itself into existence were it not for the craziness of past year. And for that too, in a way, I'm grateful. And Virginia Woolf reminded me of that. So to close things off, I wanted to go ahead and share with you the inside cover of the notebook that I use for morning pages. The very first one that I started doing, I decided to go ahead and use a picture of Virginia Woolf as my guardian spirit. And this is a fun, playful practice. I invite you to go ahead and assign a guardian spirit as well to a notebook that you might have for creative writing or morning pages or what have you. It's a fun little exercise. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. I would love to discuss all things Virginia Woolf with you. So if you have time, go ahead and comment. I read every single comment and respond to the comments. And also, if you do have time, please go ahead and like this video and share it with your friends. It would mean a lot to me. And I hope I get to catch you next time. Baka baka.